Michigan rain hangs over the Great Lakes like a held breath. Two hands of land cupping all that dark water, stitched together by pine forests, freeway exits, quiet suburbs, and vacation towns that look like postcards. But somewhere between the trailheads and the truck stops, people keep walking out of their own lives and never coming back. 10 people. 10 Michigan towns. None of them made it home. Lock your doors, pull up the map, and let's get into it. Our first stop is a stretch of Interstate 96 just outside Fowlerville, about 30 miles northwest of Ann Arbor. If you've ever driven Interstate 96 westbound on a spring afternoon, you know exactly what this stretch looks like. Flat farmland on both sides, long sight lines, no trees worth hiding behind. The kind of road where you can see a car coming from a mile away. The kind of road where, in theory, nothing bad can happen without somebody noticing. That's what makes what happened to Paige Renkoski so hard to explain. Paige was 30 years old in the spring of 1990. She lived in Okemos, a quiet suburb just outside Lansing. People who knew her describe her the same way over and over. Vivacious, funny, the kind of person who lit up a room without trying. She was a former teacher, close with her family, and on the morning of May 24th, 1990, she had a simple errand list. Drive her mother to Detroit Metropolitan Airport, visit a friend in Canton Township on the way back, then head home before dinner. That was the entire plan, a normal Thursday in a normal week. She dropped her mother at the airport without incident. She made it to her friend's house in Canton. They talked, and they caught up. And around 3 in the afternoon, Paige said her goodbyes, climbed into her white Oldsmobile Cutlass Calais, and pulled out onto westbound Interstate 96 to head back home toward Okemos. That short, simple drive should have taken her about an hour. She never made it. Here's the critical detail. At roughly 3:30 that afternoon, drivers on westbound Interstate 96 near the Fowlerville exit started noticing something odd. A white Cutlass sitting on the right shoulder, engine running, hazard lights off, driver's door not quite closed, and standing beside it, a woman in her 30s, talking to 2 or 3 men gathered around a maroon or burgundy minivan parked just in front of her car. According to multiple witness accounts later given to the Michigan State Police, the woman did not appear to be in distress. She wasn't waving for help. She wasn't running. She was just standing there in broad daylight on the shoulder of one of the busiest interstates in the state, having what looked like a conversation. Cars kept going. Nobody stopped. Nobody wrote down a license plate. Nobody could later agree on exactly how many men were there, or what they looked like, or whether the van had any markings. That's the thing about a freeway. Everybody sees it for 2 seconds, and then it's a mile behind them. And by the time the news catches up to what they witnessed, the details have already started to fade. This is where it stops being normal, becomes something else. When troopers arrived at the scene later that afternoon, the white Cutlass was still sitting on the shoulder. The engine was still running, and the keys were still in the ignition. Paige's purse was inside the car. Her shoes were on the passenger seat. The maroon van was gone, and Paige was gone with it. Think about that for a second. Her car wasn't broken down. There was no flat tire, no overheating engine, no mechanical reason for her to have pulled over on a stretch of freeway she drove all the time. The vehicle was in perfect working order. Whatever made her stop, it wasn't the car. And whatever happened after she stopped, it happened fast enough and quiet enough that nobody on that freeway thought it was worth calling in until the abandoned Cutlass had been sitting there long enough to attract attention on its own. The Michigan State Police launched an immediate search. They canvassed the freeway, the exits, the rest stops, the gas stations, none of the small towns dotting the corridor between Fowlerville and Lansing. They put out a description of the maroon van. They begged witnesses to come forward. A handful did. Their accounts overlapped on the basics: the van, the men, the woman standing calmly beside her car, but diverged on almost every specific detail that might have actually helped find her. One witness thought there were 2 men. Another thought there were 3. One described the van as red. Another said burgundy. Another said brown. Nobody remembered a plate. Nobody remembered a face well enough to build a usable composite. In an era before cell phones, before dash cams, before highway cameras at every interchange, the entire incident played out in the blind spot of an entire state. But here's what doesn't make sense. Paige Renkowski had no reason to stop. She had no known enemies. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She didn't owe anybody money. She wasn't running from anyone. She was a 30-year-old woman driving home from a friend's house on a clear afternoon. And somewhere in the space of about 10 minutes, on a freeway full of witnesses, she went from behind the wheel of her own car to standing beside a stranger's van to gone forever. No struggle, no screams that anybody reported, no skid marks, no blood, just an idling car and an empty pair of shoes. The investigation that followed was massive by 1990 standards. The Michigan State Police interviewed hundreds of people. The FBI got involved. Tips came in from across the Midwest. Sightings were reported in other states, in other countries. None of them ever panned out. Years later, investigators would publicly acknowledge that they had developed persons of interest, including at least one man already serving time for violent crimes against women in Michigan. But no charges were ever filed in connection with Paige's disappearance. No body was ever found. No physical evidence ever directly tied any suspect to that stretch of Interstate 96. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw her. Standing on the shoulder of westbound Interstate 96 in the afternoon sun, talking calmly to men she did not appear to know, while her own car idled behind her with the keys still in it. Whoever those men were, whatever they said to her, whatever happened in the next 60 seconds, it has never been answered. Not in 1990, not in the decades since, not in any of the cold case reviews that have come and gone. Now this is where the case turns dark in a quieter, more haunting way. Because Paige's family has spent more than 3 decades living with the same image. A white cutlass on a Michigan shoulder, an open driver's door, a pair of shoes on the passenger seat. The kind of detail that a screenwriter would put in a movie to suggest that something supernatural had happened, except this wasn't a movie, and the shoes were real, and the woman who took them off was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a teacher, a person who was loved. There are theories. There are always theories. Some investigators have suggested that Paige may have stopped to help someone she thought was in distress. A flat tire, a broken-down family. The kind of small kindness that turns out to be the worst decision of your life. Others have suggested that the men in the van targeted her specifically, that the encounter wasn't random at all, that someone had been watching her movements that day. Others have suggested it was purely opportunistic, the wrong woman pulling over near the wrong vehicle at the wrong time. All of those are theories. None of them have ever been proven. The official case file remains open, and the official answer to what happened to Paige Renkowski on May 24, 1990, is the same as it was the night she disappeared. Officially unknown. The final image of this case isn't a dramatic one. There are no aerial shots, no nighttime searches, no breakthrough press conferences, or it's just a white Oldsmobile sitting on the shoulder of Interstate 96 as the afternoon traffic streams past. The hazard lights never came on. The engine never stopped running. The driver never came back. And the maroon van, wherever it went, disappeared into the same Michigan afternoon that swallowed her. If you've been driving for hours and you finally stop somewhere familiar, somewhere safe, somewhere you've been 100 times before, you don't expect that to be the place where your story ends. Paige Renkoski didn't either. And the next case is worse, because this time the disappearance didn't happen on an empty freeway. It happened in a room full of people. Hundreds of them. Parents, kids, teachers, coaches. A school gym in Ada, Michigan, on a winter afternoon in 1981. And then a 14-year-old girl named Deanie Peters, who walked across that gym floor in front of everyone and was never seen again. February 5th, 1981. Ada, Michigan. A small, well-off community tucked just east of Grand Rapids. The kind of place where neighbors still know each other's last names, and the biggest event on a Thursday afternoon is a middle school wrestling match. If you've never been to one, picture this. A school gymnasium with the lights cranked all the way up. Folding chairs and bleachers packed with parents in winter coats, the squeak of sneakers on a polished floor, the smell of sweat and floor wax and concession stand popcorn, whistles, cheering, kids in singlets waiting their turn on the mats. It is, by every measurable standard, one of the safest environments a 14-year-old can be in. Hundreds of witnesses, teachers everywhere, parents in every direction. You couldn't pick a place less likely to lose a child. That's what makes what happened to Deanie Peters so hard to put into words. Deanie was 14 years old, an 8th grader. By every account from the people who knew her, she was a sweet, quiet, slightly shy girl. She had brown hair and a soft voice, and the kind of personality that didn't draw attention to itself. She liked horses. She liked her family. She had a younger brother who wrestled for Forest Hills Central Middle School. And on the afternoon of February 5th, Deanie went with her mother to watch him compete. It was a routine outing. Something they had done plenty of times before. Drive to the school, find a seat in the bleachers, cheer when it was his turn, drive home. They arrived at Forest Hills Central Middle School in the middle of the afternoon. The match was already underway. Deanie and her mother climbed the bleachers, found a spot and settled in. Deanie was wearing jeans, a winter coat, and a pair of brown leather boots. She had her hair pulled back. She was sitting close to her mother. Nothing about that afternoon, in any of the accounts later given to investigators, suggested that anything was wrong. She was not upset. She was not arguing with anyone. She had not received a strange phone call. She was, in every visible way, a 14-year-old girl watching her little brother wrestle. At some point during the match, Deanie's mother needed to use the restroom. She told Deanie she would be right back, climbed down from the bleachers, and walked out of the gym. The restrooms at Forest Hills Central are a short walk from the gymnasium, down a hallway, past a few classrooms, and back. The entire trip should have taken about 3 minutes, maybe 4. Long enough to step away. Not long enough for a 14-year-old to vanish from the middle of a packed school gym. When Deanie's mother walked back into the gymnasium, the seat where her daughter had been sitting was empty. Here's the critical detail. At first, she wasn't worried. Of course she wasn't. Deanie was 14, not 4. Maybe she had gone to the bathroom too. Maybe she had walked over to talk to a friend. Maybe she had gone to get a snack from the concession stand. Her mother scanned the bleachers, scanned the floor, scanned the doorways. No Deanie. She walked the perimeter of the gym. She checked the hallway. She checked the girls' restroom. She checked the front entrance. She checked the parking lot. Nothing. Within minutes, the worry had turned into something colder. School staff were pulled in. The wrestling match continued in the background while adults began moving with purpose through the building, checking classrooms, checking closets, checking the locker rooms, checking every place a 14-year-old girl might reasonably be. Then they checked the places she shouldn't have been: the boiler room, the custodial areas, the exterior doors. Still nothing. This is where it stops being normal and becomes something else. By the time the police were called and the building was being formally searched, the gymnasium was still full of people. Hundreds of parents, students, and staff who had been in or around that gym for the entire afternoon. Investigators went person to person, asking the same question. Did you see Deanie Peters? Did you see a 14-year-old girl in a winter coat walk out of the gym? Did you see anyone with her? Did you see anything strange? And here is where the case starts to feel almost impossible. In a room with hundreds of witnesses, on a winter afternoon under bright fluorescent lights, nobody could give a clean answer. A few people thought they might have seen her step down from the bleachers. A few others thought they might have seen her near the gym doors. But there was no clear sighting, no confirmed direction, no witness who could say with confidence, "I saw Deanie Peters walk out of this building, and this is where she went." The Kent County Sheriff's Department launched a full search that night. Volunteers came out in numbers, and they combed the school grounds, the surrounding neighborhoods, the wooded areas nearby, the ditches along the roads. Search dogs were brought in and given Deanie's scent. The dogs picked up the trail inside the school. They followed it through the building. They followed it out into the parking lot. And there, somewhere in the rows of parked cars, the trail simply ended. The dogs lost her. According to investigators, that pattern is consistent with one specific scenario: a person being placed into a vehicle. But here's what doesn't make sense. Forest Hills Central Middle School was not isolated. The parking lot was full of cars belonging to parents who were inside watching the match. People were coming and going from the building constantly. For Deanie to have been led, carried, or forced into a vehicle in that lot in broad daylight, with that level of foot traffic, somebody would have had to see something. A struggle, a raised voice, a child being pulled toward a car, anything. Investigators interviewed every adult they could find who had been in or near that parking lot during the relevant window. No one reported seeing anything unusual. No one remembered an unfamiliar car. No one remembered a strange face. The most heavily witnessed parking lot in Ada, Michigan, on the afternoon of February 5th, 1981, produced no usable witnesses to the disappearance of a child who was last tracked into it by trained search dogs. The investigation that followed was thorough by the standards of its time, and brutal by the standards of what it found, which was almost nothing. The Kent County Sheriff's Department worked the case hard for months. The detectives interviewed family members, classmates, teachers, neighbors, custodial staff, and anyone who had been at the wrestling match. They followed up on every lead, no matter how thin. Tips came in from psychics. Tips came in from people who thought they had seen Deanie in other states. Tips came in from people who claimed to know what had happened. None of them ever produced a body, a witness, or a suspect that could be charged. Over the years, certain names have surfaced in connection with the case. According to publicly reported accounts, investigators eventually developed a theory that pointed toward someone within Deanie's broader social circle, someone who reportedly had a personal grievance against her, and reportedly may have had help. Those leads have been described in various media reports as promising but uncooperative. People who, according to investigators, may know what happened to Deanie Peters, but who have refused to talk. None of those individuals have ever been charged. Everything beyond the documented timeline remains theory and unconfirmed reporting. Officially, the case is still open. Officially, The answer to what happened to Deanie Peters on the afternoon of February 5th, 1981, is unknown. In 1991, 10 years after she disappeared, Deanie was officially declared deceased. The case has been reopened and reviewed multiple times in the decades since. New detectives, new techniques, new rounds of interviews, the same wall. A girl walked into a school gymnasium with her mother. Her mother stepped away for 3 minutes. The girl was gone. The dogs followed her trail to a parking lot. And there the trail stopped, and there it has stayed for more than 40 years. Now this is where the case turns dark in the quietest possible way. Because Deanie's mother has had to live every day since 1981 with the same 3 minutes. 3 minutes to walk to a restroom and come back. 3 minutes that turned into the rest of her life. There is no version of this case where any parent can convince themselves that they did anything wrong. A 14-year-old at a school wrestling match, sitting in the bleachers with hundreds of adults around her, is supposed to be safe. That's the whole social contract of a place like that. You can step away. You can trust the room. You can come back. The final image of this case is not in the gym. It is not in the parking lot. It is not in the woods or the rivers or the search lines. It is a folding metal chair in a row of folding metal chairs in a school that no longer holds wrestling matches the same way, in a town that has never quite stopped looking. An empty seat where a quiet 8th grader was sitting a few minutes ago, and where the heat of her body has not yet faded from the cold steel. And the next case is worse, because at least Deanie Peters was a child whose family had to fight to be heard. The next person who vanished in Michigan was already one of the most famous men in the country. His face was on the front page of every newspaper in America. His name was Jimmy Hoffa, and on a hot summer afternoon in 1975, he walked into a restaurant parking lot in Bloomfield Township to meet 2 men, and the entire United States has been looking for him ever since. July 30th, 1975, Bloomfield Township, Michigan, an affluent suburb tucked into Oakland County, about 30 minutes northwest of downtown Detroit. The kind of place where the lawns are wide and the restaurants have valet parking. On the corner of Telegraph Road and Maple sits a building that, in the summer of 1975, was one of the more well-known suburban steakhouses in Metro Detroit. The Machus Red Fox, brick exterior, dark wood interior, white tablecloths. The kind of restaurant where business deals got done over thick steaks and stiff drinks. On a hot Wednesday afternoon, in the parking lot of that restaurant, the most famous labor leader in America was last seen alive. His name was James Riddle Hoffa. Most of the country knew him as Jimmy. He was 62 years old in the summer of 1975. He had spent the better part of 3 decades building the International Brotherhood of Teamsters into one of the most powerful labor unions in the world. The kind of organization that could shut down freight movement across an entire country with a single phone call. He had testified before Congress. He had publicly feuded with the Kennedys. He had been convicted in 1964 on jury tampering and fraud charges, served almost 5 years in federal prison, and been released in 1971 after his sentence was commuted by President Richard Nixon. Part of the condition of that commutation, according to widely reported accounts, was that Hoffa stay out of union activity until 1980. By the summer of 1975, Hoffa was openly fighting that restriction. He wanted his presidency back, and there were a lot of people, inside the Teamsters and outside of it, who very much did not want that to happen. Hoffa lived in Lake Orion, about 30 miles north of Bloomfield Township, in a house on a quiet lake with his wife Josephine. People who knew him in those final months describe a man who was restless, frustrated, and absolutely convinced that he was about to make a comeback. He had been making calls. He had been holding meetings. He had been telling friends that he was going to take back control of the union, no matter who tried to stop him. And on the morning of July 30th, 1975, he had a meeting on his calendar that, according to what he told his wife and a handful of close associates, was supposed to help him do exactly that. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. at the Machus Red Fox. According to Hoffa himself, in conversations with people in the days leading up to it, the meeting was with 2 men. The first was Anthony Giacalone, a reputed Detroit organized crime figure that everyone called Tony Jack. The second was Anthony Provenzano, a New Jersey labor figure with his own reputed organized crime ties, known as Tony Pro. Hoffa had a long, complicated history with both men. He had once been close with Provenzano. They had reportedly fallen out badly during their years together in federal prison. The meeting at the Machus Red Fox, as Hoffa described it to those around him, was supposed to be a sit-down to settle their differences and clear the way for his return to union leadership. Here's the critical detail. Neither Tony Jack nor Tony Pro was actually in Bloomfield Township that afternoon. Both men later provided alibis, placing them somewhere else entirely at the time of the meeting. Giacalone, according to investigators, was at a Detroit area athletic club where he was seen by multiple witnesses. Provenzano, according to investigators, was in New Jersey, playing cards with associates who later vouched for him. If a meeting had been scheduled, neither of the men Hoffa thought he was meeting ever showed up to it. Hoffa, however, did. He left his Lake Orion house around 1 p.m. He stopped briefly at the Pontiac office of a friend, Louis Lanteau, a fellow Teamster and former local union president. Lanteau wasn't there. Hoffa left a message and got back in his car, a 1974 Pontiac Grandville. He drove south on Telegraph Road toward the restaurant. He arrived at the Machus Red Fox just before 2. He parked in the lot. He went inside, looked around, didn't find his contacts, and came back out. And then, according to multiple witnesses, he walked across the lot to a payphone and called his wife. Josephine Hoffa later told investigators that her husband sounded annoyed. He told her that the people he was supposed to meet were late. He said he was going to wait a little longer. He said he would be home for dinner. That phone call, by every account that has ever been investigated, was the last verified communication anyone had with Jimmy Hoffa. It was somewhere around 2:45 in the afternoon. And from that moment forward, the timeline of one of the most famous men in America simply stops. This is where it stops being normal and becomes something else. Witnesses in and around the parking lot of the Machus Red Fox that afternoon later gave accounts that, like so many of these cases, almost line up but not quite. Several people reported seeing Hoffa standing in the lot. Several reported seeing him near a maroon or dark-colored car, possibly a Lincoln or a Mercury, with 2 or 3 other men. One witness reportedly saw Hoffa get into the back seat of that car, apparently of his own free will, and the car then drove out of the lot and turned onto Telegraph Road, heading south. Other witnesses gave slightly different versions. Some saw a different car. Some saw a different number of men. Some weren't sure what they had seen. Within 24 hours, every one of those witnesses had been interviewed multiple times. And within a week, the parking lot of the Machus Red Fox had been combed inch by investigators from local, state, and federal agencies. His Pontiac Grandville was still in the lot the next morning, unlocked. No keys inside, no blood, no sign of struggle, no note. Just a car sitting where he had parked it the day before, like its owner had stepped away for a minute and was about to come back. He never did. The investigation that followed Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance is, depending on how you measure it, one of the most extensive missing person investigations in American history. The FBI took over the case within days. They interviewed dozens of organized crime figures, Teamster officials, family members, friends, employees, and witnesses. They followed leads across state lines. They followed leads across decades. Yet names of suspects came up again and again. Tony Jack, Tony Pro, a reputed enforcer named Salvatore Briguglio, a reputed hitman named Frank Sheeran, who would later claim, in a deathbed account that has been disputed by many investigators, that he himself killed Hoffa in a Detroit area house and that the body was disposed of elsewhere. Other accounts placed Hoffa's remains in the foundations of the old Giants Stadium in New Jersey, in a horse farm outside Detroit, in a landfill in Jersey City, in a barn in Michigan, under a swimming pool, under a driveway, in the trunk of a car that was crushed at a scrapyard. The FBI has, over the years, dug up multiple sites based on tips. Fields, yards, concrete slabs. Each search has produced the same result. Nothing. But here's what doesn't make sense. For a man as recognizable as Jimmy Hoffa, in a place as visible as a suburban restaurant parking lot in the middle of a summer afternoon, the silence is staggering. Hoffa was not the kind of person who could disappear quietly. He had a face that was on national television. He had enemies who had reasons to keep their stories straight. He had friends with deep resources who had reasons to find him. And in 50 years, with all of those forces pushing in the same direction, no remains have ever been recovered. No definitive crime scene has ever been identified. No charges have ever been filed against any individual specifically for his disappearance. He was declared legally dead in 1982. 7 years after the parking lot at the Machis Red Fox went quiet. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw him. Standing in the parking lot of a Bloomfield Township steakhouse on the phone with his wife, telling her he would be home for dinner. The next time the parking lot was busy, the next morning, his Pontiac was still there. And Jimmy Hoffa was already part of American mythology. Now this is where the case turns dark in a way that has nothing to do with mob theories. Because somewhere in Michigan, or in another state entirely, there is a piece of ground that holds the answer. And at this point, most of the people who knew where it is are dead. Hoffa's children grew up. They became adults. They became old. They have spent their entire lives waiting for an answer that has never come. The Machis Red Fox restaurant is gone now, replaced by other businesses over the years. But the parking lot is still there. The asphalt is still there. The corner where the payphone used to be is still there. And every July 30th, somewhere in America, a reporter writes another story asking the same question. The final image of this case is the simplest one in the entire investigation. A 1974 Pontiac Grandville, parked in a row of cars in a suburban Michigan parking lot on a hot summer evening, while the dinner crowd files in and out of the restaurant. None of them realizing yet that the most famous missing person case in American history has just begun, 10 feet from where they're walking. And the next case is worse, because Jimmy Hoffa, for all his enemies, knew exactly what world he was operating in. The next person to vanish in Michigan was a young waitress in a small town near the Indiana border, finishing a normal shift on a normal summer night, who walked out of a diner and straight off the face of the earth. July 20th, 1975. Niles, Michigan, a small town tucked into the southwestern corner of the state, just a few miles from the Indiana border. If you've never been there, picture a place where the main street runs through the middle of town, the St. Joseph River curls along the edge, and the population in 1975 was somewhere around 13,000 people. Quiet, working class. The kind of town where most people knew the regulars at the local diner by name, and the regulars knew the waitresses by name, and everybody waved at everybody on the way out the door. 10 days before Jimmy Hoffa vanished from a parking lot 200 miles to the northeast, a young woman finished her shift at a Niles restaurant. As walked out into the warm Michigan night and never made it home. Her name was Janice Sanders. According to publicly reported accounts, she was a waitress at a local Niles establishment. And on the evening of July 20th, 1975, she worked her shift the same way she always did. She took orders. She refilled coffee. She wiped down tables. She joked with customers. And when her shift ended, she clocked out, gathered her things, said her goodbyes, and walked out the door. That moment, her stepping out of the restaurant into the summer night, is the last verified moment in her life that anyone has been able to confirm. Janice was a young woman with a future in front of her. Friends and family later described her as warm, hardworking, the kind of person who took her job seriously and treated her customers like neighbors. Because in a town like Niles, a lot of them actually were. She had a routine. She had people who loved her. She had a life she was building one shift at a time. And on a warm Sunday night in the middle of July, all of it stopped. Here's the critical detail. The case file on Janice Sanders is, by every public measure, thinner than it should be. Coverage of her disappearance in the years immediately after 1975 was limited compared to the cases that grabbed national headlines. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't the daughter of a public figure. She was a waitress in a small Michigan town in the middle of a summer when the entire country's attention was about to be hijacked by another Michigan disappearance 10 days later. By the time investigators started working her case in earnest, the trail outside that diner had already begun to cool. What is publicly known is this. After Janice left work, she did not arrive at the place she was expected to be. She did not call anyone. She did not show up the next morning. Her absence was noticed, reported, and the local police began trying to retrace her steps. Whether she walked home, whether she got into a car, whether she met someone in the parking lot, whether she was offered a ride by someone she knew or by a stranger, all of that in the public record is officially unknown. The exact route she would have taken from the restaurant to wherever she was going next is not something investigators have ever been able to confirm with witnesses. This is where it stops being normal and becomes something else. In a town the size of Niles in 1975, on a Sunday night in July, the streets were not crowded. The kind of foot traffic that might have produced a witness in a bigger city simply wasn't there. The kind of security cameras that might have caught a vehicle pulling out of a parking lot didn't exist yet. The kind of cell phone records that might have placed her in a specific location at a specific moment were still decades away from being possible. Janice Sanders walked out of that restaurant and into a gap in the technological record of America. And the gap has never closed. But here's what doesn't make sense. People who knew Janice have consistently said, in the decades since, that she had no reason to leave on her own. She wasn't running. She wasn't in trouble. She wasn't talking about disappearing. She had a life she was attached to. She had people she would have called. The idea that she simply chose to walk away from Niles, Michigan on a July night in 1975 and start over somewhere else without ever contacting anyone she loved doesn't fit anything anyone who knew her has ever said about who she was. The investigation, such as it could be reconstructed from the limited public reporting, followed the patterns of its time. Local police canvassed the area. They talked to co-workers. They talked to family. They talked to anyone who had been in the restaurant that night who could be tracked down and asked what they remembered. They produced a description of Janice. They put out the basic information. And then, slowly, the way these things often went in 1975, the case quieted. Other cases came in. Other crimes had to be worked. The file stayed open. Janice stayed gone. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw her. The end of a shift. The brush of an apron coming off. The bell on the door. The warm air outside. The lights of a Niles diner glowing behind her as she stepped down off the curb and into a night that, for everyone who loved her, has never finished happening. Decades later, the case has been picked up again by cold case investigators, including students working with the Western Michigan University Cold Case Program in collaboration with Michigan State Police, who have spent significant time trying to breathe new life into investigations like this one. So far, no breakthrough has been publicly announced. No remains have been recovered. No suspect has been publicly named. Officially, the disappearance of Janice Sanders is unknown. The final image of this case is small and quiet and almost unbearable. A pair of diner lights cutting off behind a young woman as she steps onto an empty sidewalk in a small Michigan town, alone on a warm Sunday night in 1975. No witnesses, no record, no follow-up sighting. Just a door closing and a streetlight humming in a town that has spent 50 years not knowing what happened to one of its own. And the next case is worse, because at least Janice Sanders was an adult, walking through her own town on her own terms. The next person to vanish in Michigan was 15 years old, walking out of a friend's house on a quiet suburban street in the city of Warren on a September afternoon in 1979, and the last person to see her did so in broad daylight on a block where everyone knew everyone. Her name was Kimberly Alice King. Most people called her Kim. She was 15 years old in the fall of 1979, living in Warren, Michigan, a working-class suburb directly north of Detroit. Warren is the kind of place where the streets are laid out in a tight grid, the houses sit shoulder to shoulder, and the front yards are small enough that you can stand on your porch and have a conversation with the neighbor across the street without raising your voice. Kim, by every public account, was a normal teenager. She had friends. She had family. She had a face that her loved ones still describe in vivid detail decades later. A small birthmark on her lower abdomen, a slightly upturned nose, a gap between her two front teeth. The kind of details a parent memorizes without ever meaning to, and the kind that show up on missing person flyers when the unthinkable happens. September 15th, 1979 was a Saturday. Kim spent part of the day at a friend's house in Warren. The visit, by every account that has ever been publicly described, was completely ordinary. There was no fight, no emergency, no reported reason for her to be upset or frightened. At some point in the afternoon or early evening, she got ready to leave. She put on a blue sweater and a pair of Levi jeans, the outfit that would later be listed in every law enforcement description of her, and she walked out of her friend's house into the Warren Street. From the moment she stepped off that porch, Kim King has not been confirmed seen again by anyone who has come forward to investigators in the more than 4 decades since. Here's the critical detail. Kim wasn't walking through a forest. She wasn't on a remote highway. She wasn't in a big city full of strangers. She was on a residential block in a tight Warren neighborhood, in daylight, surrounded by houses where families were home, where kids were playing in front yards, where neighbors were doing what neighbors do on a Saturday afternoon in September, and somewhere between her friend's front porch and wherever she was going next. In a span of streets that should have been the most witnessed kind of environment a teenager can walk through, she ceased to be visible to anybody who has ever spoken to police about it. The Warren Police Department has worked Kim King's case for decades. According to publicly reported accounts, foul play has been suspected from very early in the investigation. There has reportedly been a person of interest at various points over the years. No charges have been publicly filed in connection with her disappearance. No remains have been recovered. The last verified moment in her life remains a Warren porch on a Saturday afternoon in 1979. And the silence that followed it has now outlasted most of the people who were on that block when it happened. To understand how strange Kim King's disappearance really is, you have to understand what a Warren neighborhood looked like in 1979. This was not a transient part of the country. People bought houses on these blocks and stayed for 30 years. Kids grew up together. Parents knew which cars belonged on the street and which ones didn't. A stranger's vehicle parked at the curb for more than 10 minutes would get noticed. A scream from a porch would bring half the block to their windows. That was the social fabric of the place. And on the afternoon of September 15th, 1979, that fabric absorbed the disappearance of a 15-year-old girl without producing a single witness who has ever been able to fill in the gap between her last sighting and her absence. Investigators interviewed Kim's friends. They interviewed her family. They interviewed neighbors up and down the street. They put together a timeline that ended at a porch and began nowhere. They issued descriptions. They followed leads. Tips came in over the years, the way they always do in cases like this, some specific, some vague, most unverifiable. According to publicly reported accounts, the case has been reopened and reviewed multiple times. The Warren Police Department has continued to ask anyone with information to come forward. The phone number on her case file is still active. Kim King has never been found. But here's what doesn't make sense. The version of this case that the public has access to includes a teenager who left a friend's house in daylight, in a recognizable outfit, in a neighborhood where she was known. For that to result in a disappearance with 0 confirmed sightings after the fact, one of 2 things has to be true. Either she was taken almost immediately, within seconds of stepping off the porch, by someone whose movements through that block went completely unwitnessed, or she made it some distance from the friend's house, and then encountered something or someone that ended her visible trail without leaving any physical evidence behind. Both possibilities are bad. Neither has ever been confirmed. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw her. A blue sweater, a pair of Levi jeans, a 15-year-old girl stepping off a Warren porch on a September afternoon. Her family has spent every year since holding on to those details, the gap in her teeth, the small birthmark, the pug nose, the things you put on a flyer when the unimaginable becomes the only thing you have left to give a stranger who might recognize her. The final image of this case is a porch light on a Warren street, switched on by a parent at dusk on September 15th, 1979, waiting to guide a teenage daughter home. The light is still on, in a way. The case is still open. The block has changed hands a dozen times, and the neighbors who were there in 1979 have moved away or grown old or passed on. But somewhere in the city of Warren, Michigan, there are records on a desk and a photograph in a file, and a question that has never had an answer. And the next case is worse, because at least the people who loved Kim King knew where she had last been seen. The next case takes us out of the suburbs entirely, into a federal wilderness in northern Michigan, where a young woman and her infant daughter were swept up into a chain of violence so deliberate, so cold-blooded, and so terrifyingly methodical that one of them was eventually found and the other has never been recovered. The setting is the Manistee National Forest. If you've never been there, Picture more than 500,000 acres of public land sprawling across western Michigan, just inland from the Lake Michigan shoreline. Pine, hardwood, sand ridges left over from the last ice age. Two-track roads that fork off the pavement and disappear into the trees. Trails that look the same in every direction. The kind of terrain where it is genuinely possible to walk 100 yards off a road and be impossible to see from any direction. People come to the Manistee for the fishing and the hunting and the quiet. In the summer of 1997, that quiet became the cover for a crime that has shaped Michigan's understanding of what a wilderness can hide. The young woman at the center of it was named Rachel. According to publicly reported accounts and federal court records, she was 19 years old in the summer of 1997. She had a baby daughter. The baby's name was Shannon. Rachel was, at the time, a witness in a pending criminal case against a man named Marvin Gabriel, who had been charged with sexually assaulting her. Gabriel was awaiting prosecution. Rachel was preparing to testify against him. According to the public record of the case that would eventually be brought against Gabriel in federal court. That combination, a pending prosecution and a victim willing to take the stand, would prove to be the trigger for everything that followed. Here's the critical detail. Rachel was not the only witness scheduled to testify against Gabriel. Another individual connected to the case, a man named Wayne Davis, who according to publicly reported accounts had been with Gabriel on the night of the assault and was also expected to provide testimony, disappeared in February of 1997. He has never been located. He is, unto this day, listed among the people who vanished in connection with this case. Within months of Wayne Davis going missing, Rachel and her baby daughter Shannon also vanished. According to publicly reported accounts, Rachel's father received letters in the weeks after her disappearance, purporting to be from her, claiming that she and the baby were safe, that she had eloped, that there was no need to worry. Her family found those letters deeply suspicious. Rachel had said nothing to anyone about leaving Michigan. She had said nothing about a relationship that might end in marriage. She had said nothing about taking her infant daughter and starting a new life somewhere else. And the timing of the letters, arriving just after her scheduled testimony was supposed to take place, it lined up with a pattern that did not look like a young mother making a fresh start. It looked like a cover-up. This is where it stops being normal and becomes something else. On July 5, 1997, Rachel's body was discovered in the Manistee National Forest. The location was remote. The condition of the scene, as it has been publicly described in court records and reporting on the federal trial, was consistent with a deliberate, methodical homicide intended to be hidden in a place where it would not be found, in a way that would prevent identification, in a wilderness chosen specifically because it absorbs evidence. Investigators were able to identify Rachel. The federal investigation that followed would eventually lead to Marvin Gabriel's arrest, prosecution, conviction, and federal death sentence in connection with her murder. He has been incarcerated ever since. He has never publicly admitted to harming her infant daughter. And Shannon, the baby, was not found at the scene where Rachel was recovered. Shannon was not found in the days after. Shannon was not found in the weeks after. Shannon has never been found at all. But here's what doesn't make sense. The Manistee National Forest is enormous. Search teams who worked the scene around Rachel's recovery and the broader area in the years since have covered a fraction of 1% of the total acreage. According to publicly reported accounts of the federal case, Marvin Gabriel at one point allegedly told other inmates that he had killed the baby and disposed of her separately, and that he had marked the location on a map. That account, they were attributed to jailhouse sources, has been reported in multiple media outlets covering the case. Whether the map ever existed, whether the location was ever specific, whether anything Gabriel told another inmate was true at all, has never been verified to a level that has produced a recovery. Theories have been floated. None have been confirmed. Searches have been conducted in suspected areas. None have produced Shannon. The federal prosecution of Gabriel remains one of the most significant homicide cases in Michigan history, in part because it resulted in a federal death sentence based on the fact that the killing took place on federal land. But that legal landmark, as significant as it is, has never closed the part of the case that matters most to the people who loved Rachel and her daughter. Where is Shannon? Known after more than 25 years, the question still does not have an answer. Officially, the location of her remains is unknown. Officially, no map has ever been recovered. Officially, the wilderness where her mother was found has not given her up. And that's the impossible gap in this case. A convicted killer in federal custody, a scene of recovery that closed half the file, a child whose name is on the same case file but whose location is on no map that any investigator has ever been able to follow. Rachel was found. Shannon was not. And a forest the size of a small country has held that distinction for more than 2 decades, in silence, the way forests do. Now this is where the case turns dark in a way that is hard to put into words. Because somewhere in the Manistee National Forest, in a stretch of pine and sand and shadow that looks like every other stretch of pine and sand and shadow, there is a place that holds the answer. And no one alive, except possibly the man already serving a federal death sentence, knows exactly where it is. He has not led investigators to it. He has not drawn a verified map. He has not, in any public proceeding or interview, given Rachel's family or Shannon's family the one piece of information that would allow this case to actually end. The wilderness is doing what the wilderness does. It is keeping what it was given. The search effort for Shannon has continued, in waves, ever since 1997. According to publicly reported accounts, federal and state investigators have followed up on tips suggesting various locations within the Manistee National Forest and adjacent areas. Volunteer search organizations have walked grid patterns through suspected zones. Cadaver dogs have been brought in. Aerial imagery has been reviewed. Each of those efforts has been narrow by necessity, because the forest is too large for any search to be exhaustive. Each of them has produced the same result. Nothing recoverable. Nothing that connects to the child who was last known to be alive. In the spring of 1997 in Michigan, in the company of the man who would later be convicted of killing her mother in cold blood on federal land. But here's what doesn't make sense. Even within the framework of a case that has otherwise produced a conviction. If a convicted killer in federal custody has, at any point in the last 25 years, possessed real information about the location of Shannon's remains, and if he has truly told other inmates the things that have been attributed to him in the public reporting on this case, the question of why no recovery has ever followed is its own quiet horror. Either the information was never real, and the alleged statements were the embellishments of a man with nothing left to lose, or the information was real, and it has been held back, and a child's family has been allowed to wait through decades of birthdays and holidays and quiet evenings for an answer that has been within someone's reach the entire time. Both possibilities are unbearable. Investigators do not know which one is true. The Gabriel case is one of the most thoroughly documented federal prosecutions to come out of the state of Michigan in the late 20th century. Court records, transcripts, and public reporting on the trial are extensive. The conviction is solid. The sentence was handed down. The legal chapter, in the formal sense, closed years ago. But the human chapter has stayed open in a way that no verdict can address. because a verdict is not a body, and a sentence is not a recovery, and an answer that ends a court case is not the same answer that ends a search. And that's the last confirmed place anyone has put Shannon Verhage in the public record. A spring in 1997. A young mother preparing to testify against the man who hurt her. An infant daughter at her side. A federal forest in northern Michigan. A scheme to silence a witness that involved disappearing not just one person, but two people who were never going to be allowed to tell their part of the story. One of them was found, the other was not. Cure and the line between them, the line that separates a recovered victim from a missing child, is the line that has defined this case for everyone who has ever worked it. The final image of this case is not a courtroom. It is not a press conference. It is not a marker stone or a memorial. It is a fire road branching off into the Manistee National Forest on a summer afternoon, with sun cutting through the pines in long parallel beams, and not a single human voice within earshot for miles. The road forks. The trees close in. The forest does what it has done since long before anyone ever drove a vehicle into it. It absorbs whatever is brought into it, and it does not give it back. And the people who go in looking always have to come back out before nightfall. And the next case is worse, because at least the Manistee was a place chosen for its silence. The next case happened in a parking lot in metropolitan Detroit, on a security camera, in the middle of an active workplace. And the man who walked out of that camera frame was the chief executive of a community bank with a semi-automatic pistol he had purchased only weeks before. And his story is one of the strangest disappearances in modern Michigan history. September 19th, 2010. Mount Clemens, Michigan. A working community on the eastern edge of Metro Detroit, sitting along the Clinton River, a short drive from Lake St. Clair. The kind of place where the streets are quiet on a Sunday night and the office buildings clear out by sundown. On the corner of a parking lot off Cass Avenue stood the headquarters of Community Central Bank, or a small regional bank that had been struggling financially in the years after the 2008 crash. The chief executive of that bank was a man named David Widlak. He was 56 years old. He had been at the bank for years. He was, by every account, deeply invested in trying to keep the institution alive through one of the worst stretches the regional banking industry had ever seen. On the evening of September 19th, he was working late at the office. According to publicly reported accounts, he had every intention of going home that night. David Widlak was not a man who fit the profile of someone who walks away from his own life. He had a job he was fighting for. He had relationships. He had responsibilities. He had a calendar full of meetings that he was actively preparing for. Then in the weeks leading up to that Sunday evening, however, two unusual things had happened. The first was that he had reportedly purchased a semi-automatic handgun, something his close associates would later say was out of character for him. The second was that he had been actively trying to bring in new investors to stabilize the bank. Conversations that involved significant amounts of money and significant amounts of pressure. Whether either of those facts had anything to do with what happened next has never been formally established. Here's the critical detail. The Community Central Bank building was equipped with security cameras. On the evening of September 19th, those cameras recorded David Widlak inside the building, working alone for several hours after closing. They recorded him moving through the office. They recorded him at his desk. And then, around 8 in the evening, they recorded him walking from his office toward the front entrance of the bank. According to publicly reported accounts of the footage, he reached the front door, stopped, and stood there for approximately 26 seconds. Just standing, just looking, just waiting for something or considering something. And then he opened the door, walked out alone, and the camera frame went still. he never came back inside. He never reached his vehicle in any way that produced a follow-up sighting on any other camera or by any witness. The next morning, when a maintenance worker arrived at the bank, the building was unlocked. David Widlak's office was reportedly in a state of disarray that had not been there the night before. His personal belongings were still inside. His car was still in the parking lot. The chief executive of Community Central Bank was missing. This is where it stops being normal and becomes something else. Within hours, the Mount Clemens Police Department and other agencies began an active search. Friends, family, co-workers, and investigators all worked the same set of facts. Widlak had no history of disappearing voluntarily. He had no documented health crisis that would have caused him to wander. He had no relationship trouble that anyone close to him had been aware of. He had pressing work obligations that he had been actively planning to meet. He had a gun he had recently purchased, and he had a security tape that showed him pausing at the door of his own bank for 26 seconds before walking out into a Mount Clemens night that swallowed him whole. For weeks, his whereabouts were officially unknown. The community searched. Volunteers walked riverbanks and combed nearby fields. Investigators considered everything from voluntary disappearance to suicide to foul play connected to the bank's financial situation. Tips came in. None of them produced him. And then, weeks after he had walked out of that camera frame, his body was recovered from the waters of the Clinton River, not far from where the bank stood. The initial autopsy ruled out an obvious cause of death. The case was tentatively treated as an apparent drowning or possible suicide. His family, however, was not satisfied. They pushed for a second autopsy. But here's what doesn't make sense. According to publicly reported accounts, the second autopsy revealed something that the first one had missed entirely. A bullet lodged in the back of David Widlak's neck. A gunshot wound that, by every public description of it, was consistent with an execution-style killing rather than a self-inflicted injury. Investigators reportedly later recovered Widlak's missing handgun in the same general area where his body had been found. The case was reclassified. A man whose death had originally been quietly written down as a likely drowning was now officially the victim of an unsolved homicide. And a small Michigan bank had become the center of a case that nobody could quite explain. The reclassification of David Widlak's case opened more questions than it closed. The first autopsy, the one that had missed a bullet lodged in the back of a man's neck, had been performed by a county medical examiner, whose office would later draw public criticism over the handling of the case. The official explanation, as it has been reported, was that the X-ray results from the original examination had been misread. A bullet that should have been visible on imaging had been overlooked. The error meant that for weeks after Widlak's body was recovered, his death had been on the official record as something other than what it actually was. His family had been told one thing. Investigators had been working under one assumption, and the actual circumstances of his death had been sitting inside his own body, undetected, the entire time. Once the bullet was discovered, the entire case had to be rebuilt from scratch. Mount Clemens detectives, working with other agencies, went back through every piece of evidence they had collected. The security footage from the night of September 19th, the state of his office the next morning, the location of his vehicle, the recovery of his handgun, the position of his body in the Clinton River. Every detail that had been cataloged under the assumption of an unfortunate accident or a personal crisis now had to be re-examined under the assumption of an unsolved homicide. The change in framing changed everything. A man who had stood at the door of his own bank for 26 seconds who had walked out into the night carrying or accompanied by a weapon, who had ended up in a river with a bullet that the system had missed, was no longer a sad story about a stressed executive. He was a victim. Here's the critical detail. Despite the reclassification, despite the renewed investigation, despite years of work by detectives, no one has ever been publicly charged in connection with David Widlak's death. The motive, in the formal sense, has never been established. Theories have circulated for years. Some have focused on the bank itself, on the financial pressures it was under, on the investors he had been speaking with, on the people who would have had a stake in what happened to a struggling community institution in the aftermath of the 2008 crash. Other theories have focused on the recent purchase of his handgun, on the possibility that he believed he was in danger before that night, on whatever it was that made him stand at the door of his own bank for 26 seconds before walking out. None of those theories have ever been confirmed. None of them have ever produced an arrest. But here's what doesn't make sense. David Widlak was a chief executive at a regulated financial institution. His movements were not completely unobserved. His relationships were not completely undocumented. His final week of life left a paper trail that should, in theory, have given investigators material to work with. A meeting calendar, a phone log, a list of recent contacts. And yet, in more than 15 years since that Sunday night in Mount Clemens, no thread from that paper trail has been publicly developed into a charge against any individual. The man at the door of the bank stood there for 26 seconds, and then he was gone, and the silence after him has held. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw him alive. A grainy security frame in a small Michigan bank lobby. A pause at the door. A glance back into the building, or a glance out into the night. The mechanical click of a deadbolt. A man in a suit walking out into a parking lot that was no longer being watched. And a city that did not know yet that one of its residents was already on his way to becoming a case file. The final image of this case is the security footage itself. 26 seconds. A silhouette in the doorway. Hesitation. Decision. A forward step. The door closing behind him. And then the camera. Still recording. Still rolling. Still pointed at an empty entryway. Holding the same shot of the same closed door for the rest of the night. While somewhere outside the frame, the actual story of David Widlak's last hour was unfolding in a place where no camera was watching. And the next case is worse, because David Widlak, for all the questions surrounding his death, was at least a man whose body was eventually recovered. The next person to vanish in Michigan walked out of a Catholic church on a freezing January night in one of the wealthiest suburbs in the state. And what happened to her in the next few minutes has been disputed by her family, by investigators, and by every person who has tried to make sense of the evidence ever since. January 12th, 2010. Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan. An affluent enclave on the shore of Lake St. Clair, just east of Detroit. The kind of community where the streets are lined with old trees and old houses and old money. On the corner of Lakeshore Drive and Moross sits St. Paul on the Lake Catholic Church, a stone church facing the water. Its parking lot just steps away from the icy edge of the lake itself. And on the evening of January 12th, the temperature was well below freezing. The lake was frozen along the shoreline. A scattering of cars sat in the parking lot of the church as a small group of parishioners attended an evening prayer service inside. Among them was a 52-year-old woman named Joanne Matuk Roman. Joanne was a mother of 3, a devout Catholic, a longtime resident of Grosse Pointe. People who knew her described her the same way, over and over, in the days and weeks after she vanished. Warm, faithful, devoted to her children. Not the kind of person who would walk away from her own life. Not the kind of person who would walk into Lake St. Clair on a January night without coming back. On the evening of January 12th, she dressed for the cold, drove to St. Paul on the lake, parked in the church lot, and went inside for the service the same way she had on countless other evenings. The service ended in the early evening. Other parishioners began making their way out of the church, back to their cars, back to their warm houses, back to their normal Tuesday nights. Joanne Matuk Roman did not make it to her car. According to publicly reported accounts of the investigation, when family members realized she had not returned home, a search of the church grounds began that same night. Her vehicle was found in the parking lot, locked. Her purse was found inside the vehicle, or near it, depending on which account you read. Her coat was reportedly found on the rocks at the lake's edge, just yards from where her car was parked. There was no Joanne. Here's the critical detail. The lake at that point in January was partially frozen, with ice extending out from the shoreline. The shore itself was covered in snow. According to publicly reported accounts of the investigation, the snow on the ground between the church parking lot and the rocks at the water's edge did not show a clear set of footprints leading from Joanne's vehicle to the lake. There was no obvious track of a woman walking alone in heavy winter clothing across that snow toward the water. The Grosse Pointe Farms Police Department, working the case in the hours and days that followed, eventually concluded that Joanne had likely entered the lake. The official theory developed by investigators, as it was reported in local media, leaned toward an apparent drowning, with later language that included the possibility of a suicide. Joanne's family rejected that conclusion almost immediately, and they have rejected it consistently in every public statement they have made in the years since. This is where it stops being normal and becomes something else. Months after Joanne vanished from the parking lot of St. Paul on the lake, her body was reportedly recovered from the waters of the Detroit River, on the Canadian side, far from where she had last been seen. The recovery confirmed what had been feared since the night she disappeared. Joanne Matuk Roman was dead. The official cause, as it was eventually classified by authorities, was consistent with drowning. The case, in the formal sense, was treated as resolved. But the people who loved her have never accepted that classification, and they have spent more than 15 years arguing, in public and in private, that the official version of what happened that night does not match the evidence on the ground. But here's what doesn't make sense. The absence of footprints in the snow between her car and the lake has been one of the most consistently raised concerns from her family since the very beginning. If a woman had walked alone from a parking lot in heavy winter boots across a snow-covered shore to a partially frozen lake on a January night, the basic physics of the situation would have left a trail. The fact that no clear trail was reportedly documented has, for her family, been one of the central reasons they believe she was not alone when she left her car. They have publicly suggested that she was followed, that she was approached, that what happened to her in those final minutes outside the church involved at least one other person whose presence has never been formally accounted for. Investigators in Grosse Pointe Farms have, over the years, defended their handling of the case. The official conclusion, as it has been publicly reported, has not been changed. The case remains classified by authorities in a way that treats Joanne's death as a drowning rather than as a homicide. Joanne's family has filed lawsuits. They have hired private investigators. They have publicly contested the timeline, the evidence handling, and the conclusions that were drawn in the days after her body was recovered. They have pointed, again and again, to the absence of footprints, to the distance her body traveled in the lake system, and to the inconsistencies they say they have identified in the official record. None of those efforts have resulted in a public reclassification of the case. But here's what doesn't make sense from a purely physical standpoint. The currents of Lake St. Clair and the Detroit River system are not random. They have been studied. They have been mapped. The path that a body would take from the shoreline at St. Paul on the lake to the location where Joanne was eventually recovered is a long one. And the timing of that path has been one of the central points of dispute raised by her family and by the experts they have consulted. Whether the official explanation accounts for that distance and that timing in a way that satisfies the people who knew her best is, by every public statement they have made, a question they consider unanswered. Officially, the case is closed. Unofficially, for her family, it is never closed at all. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw her alive. A 52-year-old woman in a heavy winter coat, walking out of an evening prayer service at a stone church on the lakeshore, into a parking lot under a January sky, on a night cold enough to freeze the edge of the water. Her car still in its space, her coat on the rocks, the snow between the two stretches of ground holding, or not holding, the trail that would have answered everything. The final image of this case is a folded coat on cold stones, with the dark surface of Lake St. Clair just beyond it, and a stone church in the background with its lights still on, and a parking lot with one car still in it long after every other parishioner has gone home. Whether what happened in those few minutes was exactly what the official record says it was, or whether something else happened in the silence between the church door and the water, is a question that has divided the people who worked the case from the people who loved her. And the divide has not narrowed in more than a decade. And the next case is worse, because at least Joanne Matuk Roman was eventually recovered and laid to rest. The next person to vanish in Michigan was a young man with a normal day, normal plans, normal expectations of being home in time for homework, who climbed into his vehicle on an autumn afternoon in northern Michigan and never reached the front door of his own house. The setting is Grand Traverse County. If you've never been there, picture the part of Michigan that the rest of the state goes to on vacation, on the Leelanau Peninsula reaching out into Lake Michigan. Traverse City wrapped around the head of Grand Traverse Bay. Hardwood forests rolling away from the water in every direction, broken by orchards, farm roads, two-lane highways, and small communities tucked into the trees. In the autumn, the leaves turn so hard that the entire county looks like it has been set on fire from above. It is one of the most photographed regions in the Midwest, and it is also one of the most quietly dangerous, because the forests that make it beautiful are the same forests that swallow people without leaving a trace. In 2010, that is exactly what happened to a young man named Jacob Kavanagh. Jacob was in his early 20s. According to publicly reported accounts and the work of cold case investigators with the Western Michigan University Cold Case Program, who have spent significant time on his file, Jacob lived in the Grand Traverse area, worked a job, and had a routine that the people who knew him could describe in detail. Friends, family, hobbies, the kind of life that produces a daily rhythm. On the day he vanished, he had been doing one of the things he loved most. He had gone disc golfing with a friend. By every account, the outing had been completely normal. They had played their round. They had talked. They had finished. They had said their goodbyes. And then Jacob had gotten into his vehicle to head home from work and from the day's outing, with the stated intention of doing homework when he got there. Here's the critical detail. Then Jacob never made it home. The drive he was taking should have been a straightforward one through familiar northern Michigan roads. The terrain along that drive includes long stretches of hardwood forest, county roads with light traffic, intersections that go quiet after dark, and the kind of rural landscape where a vehicle pulling off onto a side road can disappear from view in seconds. Whether Jacob made it part of the way home and was diverted, whether he was forced off the road, whether he chose to take a detour that ended badly, whether something happened with his vehicle that left him stranded somewhere remote, all of that, in the public record, is officially unknown. The exact moment at which his planned route home turned into something else has never been pinpointed. This is where it stops being normal and becomes something else. And when Jacob did not arrive home, his absence was eventually noticed and reported. The Grand Traverse County Sheriff's Office began investigating. According to publicly reported accounts, students from the Western Michigan University Cold Case program were brought in at a later stage to assist with the file. Working alongside detectives to comb through records, build a clearer timeline, and try to identify leads that earlier work had not yet developed. Searches were conducted, areas were combed. The kind of effort that goes into looking for a young man in a county full of woods, lakes, and back roads is enormous. And it is also limited by the same fact that makes northern Michigan beautiful. There is more terrain than there are searchers. There are more trees than there are eyes. There is more silence than there is sound. But here's what doesn't make sense. Jacob was not a man who fit any of the patterns of voluntary disappearance. He had not told anyone he was leaving. He had not gathered belongings to take with him. He had not, by any account that has been publicly described, expressed any desire to start over somewhere else. He had work he had been planning to do that night. He had relationships that anchored him to his life. The idea that he chose, in the middle of a normal afternoon, after a normal disc golf round, to walk away from everything he had ever known, is a theory that the people who knew him have consistently said does not fit who he was. The investigation into Jacob's disappearance has continued for years. According to publicly reported accounts, the Western Michigan University Cold Case program has spent significant student hours on the file, working with the Grand Traverse County Sheriff's Office to push the case forward. Tips have come in. Leads have been followed. Areas of interest have been identified and searched. None of those efforts have produced a publicly announced breakthrough. No remains have been recovered. No clear suspect has been publicly named. The official answer to what happened to Jacob Kavanagh on his drive home that day in 2010 is the same as it was when his family first realized he was not coming back. Unknown. And that's the last confirmed moment in his timeline. A disc golf course in Grand Traverse County. A friend waving goodbye. A vehicle pulling onto the road. The autumn light cutting through the trees on either side of the pavement. And a young man heading home for an evening of homework with no reason to believe that the route in front of him was about to become the last route he would ever take. From that point forward, the public record of his life is a series of empty boxes. Where was the car? Where did it stop? Who, if anyone, did he encounter? What happened in the gap between the disc golf course and the front door he never opened? None of those boxes have been filled in. Now this is where the case turns dark in the way that only northern Michigan cases can. Because the country he was driving through is the same country where, every year, hunters find things in the woods that they do not expect to find. Bones, old vehicles, personal items half buried in the leaf litter. The forests of Grand Traverse County have a history of giving up their secrets slowly, sometimes a decade at a time, sometimes never. Jacob's family has lived inside that uncertainty for years, knowing that every fall, when the leaves come down and the brush thins out and the deer hunters fan out across the county, there is another window in which something might be found. So far, none of those windows has produced him. The final image of this case is a single disc. sitting in the bottom of a metal basket on a disc golf course in Grand Traverse County, on an afternoon when the autumn light is fading and the players are loading their bags into their cars and heading home. The course is quiet. The trees around it lean in the wind. Somewhere on a road that runs out of that course, a young man's vehicle was the last one to leave that day, and the road carried him toward a destination that has never been confirmed. The basket is still standing. The course is still open. The drive home that he was supposed to take is still a real drive that anyone can make, on any afternoon, in any season. The only thing missing is the person who was supposed to make it. And the next case is worse, because at least Jacob Kavanagh was an adult, on his own, making decisions about his own day. The next case takes us to the smallest possible setting in this entire episode. A motel room in a small Michigan town on Thanksgiving weekend, where 3 young brothers were dropped off for a routine visit with their father, where they were last seen alive in the kind of ordinary domestic moment that no one ever expects to be the last of anything, and where the investigation that followed has produced one of the most painful, unanswered questions in the entire history of Michigan missing persons cases. November 26, 2010, Morenci, Michigan. A small town in Lenawee County, just a few miles from the Ohio border, surrounded by farm fields and quiet 2-lane roads. Population in the low 2000s. The kind of place where the high school football schedule is the biggest news of the week, and the diner on the main drag knows what you order before you sit down. Thanksgiving weekend in 2010 was cold and gray. In a modest house in Morenci, 3 young brothers were spending the weekend with their father as part of a court-arranged custody visit. Their names were Andrew Skelton, Alexander Skelton, and Tanner Skelton. Andrew was 9 years old, Alexander was 7, and Tanner was 5. 3 boys whose photographs would be on missing children flyers within 48 hours, and whose faces would become some of the most recognized in the entire state of Michigan. Their parents had been going through a difficult separation. Custody had been arranged through the courts. The Thanksgiving weekend visit was scheduled. The boys were dropped off with their father, John Skelton, on Friday. According to publicly reported accounts of the case, the visit was, on the surface, unremarkable for the first day. The boys were with their father in the Morenci house. They reportedly had contact with their mother by phone. They did the kinds of things that 3 young brothers do on a weekend. They played. They ate. They went to bed. And then, on the morning of Friday, November 26th, the entire situation collapsed into a nightmare that has never resolved. Here's the critical detail. The boys were supposed to be returned to their mother that day. The exchange did not happen. According to publicly reported accounts, when their mother realized that she had not received her sons back at the appointed time, she contacted authorities, and the search began almost immediately. When investigators reached the Morenci house, they found John Skelton inside. He was injured. According to publicly reported accounts, he was reportedly transported to a hospital after what authorities described as an apparent suicide attempt. He survived. The boys were not in the house. The boys were not with any relative. The boys were not at any of the places where their father initially suggested they might be. The boys were, in every measurable sense, simply gone. This is where it stops being normal and becomes something else. In the hours and days that followed, John Skelton gave investigators a series of accounts about what had happened to his sons that, according to publicly reported accounts of the case, did not consistently line up with each other. He, at various points, reportedly suggested that he had handed the boys over to a third party for safekeeping. He reportedly named individuals or groups whose existence investigators were never able to verify. He reportedly described scenarios that, when followed up, did not produce the boys or anyone who matched the descriptions he had given. The shifting nature of his statements became, very quickly, one of the central reasons that investigators did not believe his version of events. The Morenci Police Department, working with the Michigan State Police, the FBI, and a coalition of local and federal agencies, launched one of the largest missing children investigations in modern Michigan history. Volunteers came from across the state and from across the country. Search teams walked fields. Search teams searched the Tiffin River and other waterways in the area. Search teams went door to door in Morenci and the surrounding communities. The search extended into Ohio, into Indiana, into the rural countryside on both sides of the state line. Every barn, every shed, every abandoned structure, every patch of woods within a credible radius of the Morenci house was, in some form, walked over by people looking for any sign of 3 young boys who had simply vanished from a Thanksgiving weekend visit. But here's what doesn't make sense. Even within the awful framework of a custody case gone catastrophically wrong, 3 children do not disappear cleanly. 3 children leave traces. 3 children leave witnesses. 3 children leave physical evidence behind in the places they have been. And in the case of Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton, the investigation that followed has, according to publicly reported accounts, never produced any verified physical evidence of where the boys went after they were last seen inside that Morenci house. No confirmed sighting, no recovered remains, no definitive crime scene that could be tied directly to the moment they ceased to be visible in the world. John Skelton was eventually charged in connection with the boys' disappearance. He was convicted, according to publicly reported accounts, of unlawful imprisonment in connection with the case, and sentenced to a prison term that has kept him incarcerated. He has not, in any of the public accounts of his statements over the years, ever provided a verified location for his sons. He has, at various points, and through various intermediaries, reportedly continued to suggest scenarios that investigators have publicly described as inconsistent with the evidence. He has reportedly continued to deny the version of events that investigators believe most closely matches what happened that weekend. He has, in every meaningful sense, taken whatever he knows about the fate of his 3 sons with him into a prison cell. And the boy's mother has spent every year since 2010 fighting the legal and emotional battle that comes with being the parent of 3 children who are officially missing rather than officially declared deceased. That legal battle has played out in Michigan courtrooms in the years since. According to publicly reported accounts, the boy's mother has at various points sought to have her sons formally declared deceased, both as a matter of legal closure and as a way of clarifying their status in the public record. Judges have considered her requests. Decisions have been issued. The legal status of the case has shifted in technical ways at various points. None of those shifts has produced what every search team, every investigator, and every member of the Skelton family has actually been waiting for, which is the recovery of the boys themselves. Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner remain on the rolls of missing persons in the state of Michigan. The Morenci case file remains, in every meaningful sense, open. And that's the last confirmed time anyone outside of John Skelton can say that those 3 brothers were seen alive. A modest house in a small Michigan town. A Thanksgiving weekend custody visit. 3 boys aged 9, 7, and 5. Sleeping under the same roof on a Thursday night in November 2010, with the cold air of a Lenawee County autumn pressing against the windows. Whatever happened in that house in the hours after they last spoke to their mother by phone has not been answered to the satisfaction of investigators, prosecutors, family members, or the public. And the silence around it has hardened year after year. but into one of the most painful, unsolved cases in the modern history of Michigan child disappearances. Now this is where the case turns dark in a way that has nothing to do with theories or media coverage or court filings. Because somewhere in southeastern Michigan or in northwestern Ohio or in the borderland between the two states, there is a place that holds the answer to what happened to three brothers who should be in their 20s right now. Learning to drive, finishing school, beginning their adult lives. Andrew would be in his mid-20s. Alexander would be in his early 20s. Tanner would be approaching his 20s. They would be men. They are not. They are still 9 and 7 and 5. In every photograph that has ever been published of them, are frozen at the ages they were the last time anyone outside of one Morenci house could confirm that they were alive. The volunteer search effort around the Skelton case was unlike almost anything Michigan had seen for a missing child investigation in the preceding decade. Word spread through the state and out across the country within days. People drove to Morenci from across the Midwest, some of them strangers who had simply seen the faces on the news and decided that they could not sit still. They walked cornfields in the cold. They moved in grid patterns through brush lines and drainage ditches. They knocked on doors in farming communities where nobody had locked a door in years. Morenci, a town that was not built to absorb that kind of sudden attention, became the center of a search operation that filled its parking lots, its diners, and ran its gas stations with people who had come looking for three boys they had never met. The search extended into the Tiffin River and its tributaries. It extended into wooded areas south of Morenci and north of the Ohio line. It extended, according to publicly reported accounts, into locations in Ohio and possibly Indiana, where investigators had reasons to look based on the shifting statements John Skelton had given in the immediate aftermath of the boy's disappearance. Every one of those searches was conducted with the same hope, and every one of those searches produced the same result. No physical trace of Andrew, Alexander, or Tanner Skelton has ever been publicly confirmed to have been recovered. Not a shoe, not a coat, not a confirmed item of clothing or personal belonging tied to the boys in any place other than the house they had been staying in the night before they vanished. Here's the critical detail. In the years since the boys' disappearance, John Skelton has remained the only human being alive who, according to investigators, likely knows exactly what happened in that Morenci house between the phone call on Thanksgiving night and the morning he was found injured inside it. He has been interviewed. He has been investigated. He has been prosecuted and convicted and sentenced. And none of those processes have dislodged the answer from wherever it sits in his account of events. Multiple accounts attributed to him over the years, as they have been publicly described, have reportedly suggested scenarios involving other people, other locations, and other outcomes that investigators have not been able to verify. The distance between what he has said and what can be proven is, at this point, measured in years rather than in hours or days. But here's what doesn't make sense in the cold, procedural version of this case. Three young brothers in a small Michigan town, in a modest house, on a holiday weekend, in 2010, in the age of cell phones, highway cameras, license plate readers, and digital records, should not be able to disappear without leaving at least one traceable footprint in a system built for the opposite. And yet, the formal trail goes dark at the doorway of that house. Whatever left the property left it in a way that has not, in more than a decade of investigation, produced a confirmed sighting anywhere downstream of that doorway. The boys who walked around a Morenci living room on a Thursday night in 2010 have not, to the satisfaction of public investigators, been visibly placed anywhere else by anyone who has come forward since. The case has continued to produce periodic news coverage in the years since. Anniversaries, court filings, renewed appeals from the boy's mother for any information that might finally put an end to her children's status as officially missing. Each of those moments has reopened the wound for the people who loved Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. And each of them has passed without producing the answer that would actually close it. The ages the boys would have reached by now have been calculated publicly more than once. The milestones they should have hit, the grades they should have finished, the adult faces they should be showing the world have all been markers of time moving forward, while the case itself has not moved at all. And that's the terrible, unresolved center of this entire story. 3 brothers, in 3 separate bunks, in a single Morenci room, on a single Thanksgiving weekend. A father whose statements have not lined up with the physical evidence. A mother who has spent more than a decade asking for her children back. A small Michigan town that became, overnight, the location of a case file that will probably outlive everyone who is currently working on it. A volunteer search network that, at its peak, had hundreds of people walking the fields around a Lenawee County house in the hope of finding something to put a name back onto a body. And at the end of all of it, a court conviction for a crime less than homicide because the state could not prove the rest of what everyone working the case believed had happened. Now this is where the case turns dark in the final way that a missing child case can. Because Andrew and Alexander and Tanner Skelton are not abstract names. They are 3 specific boys with specific photographs that everyone in the state of Michigan has seen at least once. They are a 9-year-old in a striped shirt, a 7-year-old with a wide open smile, a 5-year-old whose face in the family photographs that have been shared publicly is the face of a child who is still small enough to be picked up. Those 3 photographs have now been on missing children posters for more than a decade. They have been reprinted and reposted every November, every Thanksgiving, every anniversary. They have not aged. The boys in them have not aged. The rest of the world has. The final image of this case is 3 small beds in a quiet bedroom, unmade the way children leave them after a night of restless sleep. Stuffed animals on the floor, a pair of small shoes near the door, a winter coat on a hook, the kind of domestic detail that a mother memorizes without meaning to. And around those empty beds, a house full of investigators doing the slowest and most painful work in all of law enforcement. Looking for clues in a room where the children who slept there are no longer waking up and trying to reconstruct. From objects and fingerprints and shifting statements, a timeline that should never have become a timeline in the first place. And the next part of this story is not another case. It is the return. It is the moment where we pull back from the single Morenci bedroom and look at the entire state again. And we count the places these people vanished from. And we ask ourselves what all of them have in common, and what all of them refuse to answer. Because Michigan is not just one case. Michigan is not just Paige standing on the shoulder of Interstate 96 in the broad afternoon light. Michigan is not just Deanie Peters walking out of a school gymnasium full of parents. Michigan is not just Jimmy Hoffa pausing at a payphone outside the Machis Red Fox. Michigan is not just Janice Sanders stepping out of a small-town diner in Niles on a summer night. Michigan is not just Kim King leaving a friend's porch in Warren on a September afternoon. Michigan is not just Rachel and her daughter Shannon disappearing into the Manistee National Forest in 1997. Michigan is not just David Widlak hesitating at the door of his own bank for 26 seconds on a Sunday evening in Mount Clemens. Michigan is not just Joanne Matuk Roman walking out of a Grosse Pointe church into a January night that did not bring her home. Michigan is not just Jacob Kavanagh driving out of a Grand Traverse County disc golf course into an autumn afternoon that never ended. Michigan is not just Andrew and Alexander and Tanner Skelton falling asleep in a Morenci bedroom for what would turn out to be the last confirmed time anyone could place them on a map. Michigan is all of them. At once. In the same file. 10 names. 10 last moments. 10 places that should not have been the last places. Yes, and between them, a pattern that nobody has been able to put into a single sentence. Because the pattern keeps shifting depending on which case you are looking at and which era you are looking at it in. Some of these people vanished in the middle of witnesses. Some of them vanished in the middle of wilderness. Some of them vanished from parking lots. Some of them vanished from porches. Some of them vanished at the wheel of their own cars. Some of them vanished in their own beds. The one thing that every single one of them has in common is the thing that has brought us here together. None of them have been fully returned to the people who loved them. None of their files are fully closed. None of the last doors they walked through have ever reopened. That is the part of this story that is hardest to carry. Not any single case, because any single case is, by itself, a tragedy that the human mind can almost wrap itself around. But all of them, lined up next to each other on the same map, in the same state, in the same handful of decades, is something different. It is a pattern that refuses to make sense. It is a line of empty chairs in a state full of people. Pull the map back up. Look at the shape of the state. 2 hands cupping the Great Lakes, just the way we started. Now mark the 10 places we've just walked through, one by one, and watch what happens to the outline of Michigan when you do. Start in the south, along the Indiana border, and drop a pin on Niles. That's where Janice Sanders walked out of a small-town diner into a warm July night in 1975 and never came back, and where the lights of that restaurant have been cutting off behind her, and in the imagination of everyone who has ever worked her case for 50 years. Move east along the state line and drop another pin on Morenci. That's where Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton fell asleep in a modest Lenawee County house on a Thanksgiving weekend in 2010, and where 3 small beds in a quiet bedroom have been waiting for 3 brothers who should be grown men by now. Move north and east into Metro Detroit and drop a pin on Warren. That's where Kim King stepped off a friend's porch in a blue sweater and a pair of Levi jeans on a September afternoon in 1979. And where a porch light on a residential block has been switched on every dusk since for a 15-year-old girl who has not come home. Drop another pin in Bloomfield Township. Because that's where Jimmy Hoffa stood in the parking lot of the Machis Red Fox at 2 in the afternoon on July 30th, 1975. And where an empty parking space has become one of the most famous pieces of asphalt in the history of American unsolved cases. Drop a pin in Grosse Pointe Farms, right on the lakeshore. That's where Joanne Matuk Roman walked out of St. Paul on the Lake into a January night in 2010. And where a coat on the rocks has never stopped being the most disputed piece of evidence her family has ever had to argue about. Drop another pin in Mount Clemens. That's where David Widlak paused at the door of his own bank for 26 seconds on a Sunday evening in September 2010, and where the security camera is still, in a way, holding that shot. Move west now, to drop a pin on Interstate 96 near Fowlerville. That's where Paige stood on the shoulder in broad daylight on May 24th, 1990, beside a running car and a pair of shoes on the passenger seat. And where the maroon van she was last seen talking to has never been identified. Drop a pin in Ada, just east of Grand Rapids. That's where Deanie Peters walked out of a middle school gymnasium full of parents on a February afternoon in 1981. And where a folding metal chair has been holding the warmth of her absence for more than 40 years. Move north to the Lake Michigan side and drop a pin on the Manistee National Forest. That's where Rachel was recovered in the summer of 1997, on federal land, in one of the largest wildernesses in the state, mossed, and where her infant daughter Shannon has never been found. even after a federal conviction and a death sentence and more than 25 years of searching. Finally, move up into Grand Traverse County and drop a pin on the drive home from a disc golf course. That's where Jacob Kavanagh climbed into his vehicle on an autumn afternoon in 2010 with the intention of going home to do homework, and where the route he was taking has never been fully reconstructed by any investigator who has worked the file since. Now step back from the map and look at the shape of what you have just made. 10 pins, 10 towns, 10 doorways, 1 state. And between all of them, a set of cases that span almost 40 years, cross every kind of geography Michigan has to offer, include people of every age and background, and share exactly one thing, and they have not ended. Not one of them. Not cleanly. Not in a way that the people who loved these names can close the file and move forward with the rest of their lives without a question mark sitting on top of every memory. The ritual we started this with was a simple one. Lock your doors, pull up the map, and let's get into it. We have walked through the map. We have stood in each of those 10 places. We have traced the last confirmed minutes of 10 human beings who, on the morning of the day they vanished, had no idea that their day was going to be the last one that anybody could account for. Paige Renkowski thought she was driving home from a friend's house. Deanie Peters thought she was watching her brother wrestle. Jimmy Hoffa thought he was going home for dinner. Janice Sanders thought she was finishing a shift. Kim King thought she was walking off a porch. Rachel thought she was preparing to testify. David Widlak thought he was closing up his own bank. Joanne Matuk Roman thought she was going home from an evening prayer service. Jacob Kavanagh thought he was heading home to do homework. Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton thought they were on a routine Thanksgiving weekend visit with their father. Not one of them thought they were leaving for good. That is the part of this that does not go away after you close the case file. You can memorize the timelines. You can learn every geographic detail. You can read the court transcripts and the local news archives and the cold case program summaries and the public reports on every single one of these investigations. And at the end of all of that, the thing that sits with you is not the forensic picture. It is the ordinariness. It is the fact that every single one of these people was, on the day their story ended, doing something that you have probably done this week. Driving home from a friend's house, watching a kid at a school event, meeting someone at a restaurant, finishing a shift, visiting a friend, going to church, closing up an office, driving home from an afternoon with a friend, going to bed in a house that was supposed to be safe. Nothing about any of those activities on the surface predicted what happened. That is why these cases keep returning to us. That is why Michigan, with all its quiet suburbs and all its beautiful forests and all its long, straight interstates, is not just a map of places. It is a map of ordinary doorways that for 10 people, turned into doorways out of the visible world. Once you have seen the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The next time you pull onto Interstate 96 on a clear afternoon, or walk out of a restaurant in a small town on a summer night, or sit in the bleachers at a school gym while a parent steps away to the restroom, or pause at the front door of a building before walking out into a parking lot, the pattern will be there, somewhere at the edge of your awareness. That is what these cases leave behind. And so, at the end of this walk through the map, we do not get a clean ending. We do not get the closing music and the satisfied exhale of a case solved. We get something quieter and harder. We get 10 names that have not been fully returned to the people who love them, and a state that is still, somewhere, holding the answers. On every one of these cases could still be broken. Every one of these names could still be brought home. A tip, a confession, a skeleton turned up in a field by a farmer who was not looking for one. a long-forgotten piece of physical evidence that finally gets matched to a DNA profile. A witness who finally decides, after 40 years of silence, that they cannot take it to the grave. None of those possibilities are closed. None of these files are over. Lock your doors. Pull up the map. Remember the 10 towns: Fowlerville, Ada, Bloomfield, Niles, Warren, Manistee, Mount Clemens, Grosse Pointe, Grand Traverse, Morenci. 10 places in one state, where 10 ordinary doorways turned into something else. Somewhere in each of those places, there is still a porch light on, and a folding chair waiting, and an empty parking space, and a freeway shoulder where a pair of shoes once sat on a passenger seat in broad daylight, and a small bedroom with 3 unmade beds, and a forest road branching off into the pines. They are all still there. They are all still waiting. And the only thing any of us can do, from wherever we are watching this, is remember the names, carry the faces, and keep the ordinary doorways in mind the next time we walk through one. Michigan is still looking. So are their families. So should you be.